Hi, Yinnies. Welcome to a Yin Yoga podcast. If you are new around here, welcome. If you are familiar, welcome back. Just a quick reminder before we hop into today's episode is that this is an adult podcast with adult subject matter and adult language. So if you have small people around, take a moment to pause this and go grab yourself some headphones now. Okay, friends. Today's topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart. And we're going to talk about a loving kindness or metta practice and how we can use this both in our own practice, but also with our students. I've been doing metta practices for, I can't even think how many years, probably almost 20. And they are a real staple in my own personal practice. And I also love to offer that to students. So we're going to talk all about the who, what, when, where, why, how, and some of the recent studies that have been done as well on metta practice, some of the recent scientific studies. And then also, how would you actually use this in your class? So we're going to go into the who it's for, why we might want to do it, the when, the why, the how, the whole enchilada of metta today for this episode. So just before we get into that, I wanted to read a little bit of feedback about my yin training from somebody who graduated recently. If you are listening to this when it goes live, then you will have missed the fall 2024 registration round because we'll be in it. But there is a spring round as well. And so the best way to find out about these trainings as soon as they go live is to get on the wait list. So if you go into the episode notes, you're going to see a link that says get on the wait list. Click that link. Look way up on the top of the page where you see my picture. There's a little button there. You can click that, enter your name and email. Or way down at the bottom, there's another opportunity there to enter your name and email. And if you're there long enough reading, there'll even be a little polite pop-up that will slide in from the side asking if you want to be on the wait list. When you join the wait list, not only do you get advanced registration notice, but you also get a couple little gifties from me. So you get a sequence and a video that goes along with that sequence so that you can practice the sequence. And you'll also get regular content. So you'll get these podcast episodes, extra little goodies, especially close to registration. I share little sneak peek videos behind the scenes of the practice. I share music and other resources and sequences and just a whole bunch of different things as you're on the wait list on the way to registration opening. So that's one of the reasons you may want to join the wait list to get all that goodness. Also, I open the registration up first to the wait list. So before I put it on my website, before I put it out on social media and start sharing it around, you all that are on the wait list get advanced registration notice. You also get the first 5 that sign up, you get access to a discount code that is only available on the wait list. And that's a 25% off discount code for the first 5 people who sign up, only available to people on the wait list. And that can really help if you've been wanting to take a training, but, let's face it, the economy is a little tough right now. So, getting that discount can be super helpful. So that is a little bit about the wait list. If you want to get on the wait list, again, just link in the show notes, click the one that says get on the wait list and enter your name and email at the top or the bottom, or wait for the polite pop-up. Here's some feedback from Matthew, who took my training the last round, spring round. Before starting this training, I had a very limited knowledge of Yin Yoga. It was incredibly informative, and I was especially fascinated to learn about the sinew channels. I also really liked how the relationship between the elements was presented, especially the early Taoist representation. I had an idea from listening to Nick's podcast episodes that Yin Yoga was the quiet yoga, but actually delving into the nuts and bolts gave me a much better appreciation regarding the nuances of how Yin is structured and just how adaptable of a practice it is when it comes to individual students, which is something I think more flow-based yoga sometimes lacks. I liked creating the classes, speaking of the homework assignments now, in the second and third assignments, because it really helped me to see how the different poses interact and complement one another. I think my biggest takeaway was just how much I enjoyed getting into the practices that I was able to do. both during the training on the weekends and the recordings, and just how calming and subdued of a practice it could be versus some of the flying circus classes I did when I started practicing 8 years ago. If you had told me 5 years ago when I graduated from my first 200 that I would have taken to Yin Yoga the way I have, I would have looked at you sideways. But I really love that it's about getting in touch with your body, not performing sequences on each side or toning specific muscles in certain poses. I will 110% recommend this training to other teachers. I don't know if there's anything I would have liked more of. However, I can see myself taking this training again in a year or so. Thank you, Matthew. All right, my friends. So without further ado, let's get into today's topic. So for those of you that are watching on the YouTubes, I have notes because I wanted to really dive a little deeper into this topic. And so I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. So if you see my eyes darting around, that's because I'm looking at my note. Okay, my friends. So first of all, let's just do the kind of who, what, when, where, why of a metta practice. And then we'll get into the how I practice it in my own life, how I use it in my classes, etc., etc. What my students have said about the practice. We'll get to that. Also, I will leave in the show notes links to 3 books that I think are really good on metta. So if you do want to dive a little bit deeper, you can read those. The best way, though, honestly, to learn a metta practice is to find a Buddhist teacher in your area and learn it directly from a teacher. That is always the best way. But reading those books can help to give you a bit more of a framework if after this episode your whistle is wet and you want to do a little bit more. Okay. What is metta or loving kindness meditation? So I'm going to mostly try to call it metta, but I will bounce back and forth a bit from loving kindness to metta, simply because metta is quicker and easier to say. But loving kindness meditation is an old Buddhist practice that cultivates goodwill and universal friendliness to yourself and to others. Loving kindness is the English translation of Metta Bhavana, which is the first of the 4 Brahma Viharas, which are all meditation practices that were taught by the Buddha to cultivate positive emotions. Loving kindness meditation focuses on generating a loving kindness attitude towards oneself and to others in sort of a staged way, eventually leading to all beings, both seen and unseen in the whole universe. Metta is sometimes also translated as universal friendliness, which I actually love the most. But because I didn't hear that until a few years ago, I still always call it loving kindness because that's what's drilled into my head. But universal friendliness or loving friendliness. There has been recently a lot of scientific study on the benefits of this practice, and I will just go over those in point form, and I will also link to the article that I'm reading them from so that if you want to read the whole article and the links embedded to them to each study, you'll have plenty of opportunity to do that. But recent scientific research has shown that metta meditation enhances mental well-being in many ways, which we will discuss. So first, briefly, let's just talk about the 4 Brahma Viharas. Now, we're only going to talk about the first one today. Otherwise, this could be a very long episode. But loving kindness meditation is the foundation of 4 Buddhist meditation practices called the 4 Brahma Viharas, also sometimes called the 4 divine abodes, the 4 immeasurables. And these are a set of complementary meditation practices that work on cultivating positive emotions. So the idea is that you would actually learn these in order. The first one is called metta, loving kindness. Now, that's the Pali word. Pali is another ancient language, which was used in a kind of a different area of the world than Sanskrit. The Sanskrit is pronounced Maitre, if I get that right. Sort of like Maitri or Maitre. So that's the Sanskrit. So that's the first of the 4 Brahma Viharas. The second one is Karuna, which means compassion. Mudita, which means appreciative joy. And I don't know if I'm saying this one correctly. Uppekeha, it's Uppekeha. I've never actually tried to say that out loud. I've only read it. And that is equanimity. So each of these positive meditation practices provides a foundation for the next. So for example, we need to generate loving kindness in order to cultivate compassion. And then we would need both loving kindness and compassion in order to cultivate the appreciative joy that celebrates other people's success. So the Buddha prescribed these practices as a method for transforming the opposing emotional states. So for example, loving kindness overcomes hatred. Compassion overcomes cruelty. Appreciative joy overcomes envy. And when you have managed to overcome those together, you would have a state of equanimity, which would be the fourth. When these three practices are combined, a state of serenity is eventually attained, called equanimity. And this is the emotional foundation for the freedom of suffering. The story goes a little something like this. The Buddha taught the benefits of metta meditation to the monks that were having trouble concentrating when meditating in the forest because of fear. The Buddha taught metta to the monks to help them overcome the fear while meditating alone in the forest, where really they're at the mercy of what could be many dangers. Lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. The rationale for the practice was that generating goodwill to all living beings banishes fear because loving kindness and fear cannot coexist. So metta is both protective, both physically and mentally. So Buddha taught the monks metta because love and fear cannot coexist. And this lack of fear made the monks less vulnerable. It calmed them down, and they created less disturbance in the forest. And the story was that once the monks began to practice metta meditation, the tree and earth spirits were pacified and protected them during their practice. According to the Buddha, in a talk that he gave on the 11 benefits of loving kindness meditation, some of which are now supported by science, which we'll talk about in a moment. You sleep well. Number 2, you awaken refreshed. 3, you don't have bad dreams. 4, people regard you with affection. 5, animals and pets regard you with affection. Number 6, celestial beings protect you. I don't know about you, but I could use a little more of that. That you'll be free from injury from fire, weapons, and poison. That you can concentrate quickly. You will have a more bright complexion. And that you will die peacefully, free from fear and agitation. And that if you fail to attain enlightenment, you will at least have a pleasant rebirth if you practice metta. So those are some of the reasons that the Buddha historically gave for why we might want to do metta meditation. I'll talk a little bit more about why I practice it and what I've noticed with students in a little bit, but let's just dive into this article. So this is from Psychology Today, and I will again put a link in the show notes so that you can check it out in detail, so that this doesn't just become historical and woo-woo, but there's actually some science to back it up for those of you who appreciate that. So the first one is that it increases positive emotions and decreases negative emotions. According to Psychology Today, which I'm just going over this in point form right now from their article, there was a study by Barbara Fredrickson and her colleagues that found that practicing 7 weeks of loving kindness meditation increased love, joy, contentment, gratitude, pride, hope, interest, amusement, and awe. These positive emotions produced increases in a wide range of personal resources, which is very cool. Increased vagal tone, which then increases positive emotions and social connections. A study by KOK et al. In 2013 found that individuals in a loving kindness meditation compared to a control group had an increase in positive emotions, an effect moderated by a baseline of vagal tone, which is a psychological marker for well-being. So healing, we don't often think of meditation being able to help us with severe physical ailments, but research shows that it can. It can decrease migraines. So according to a study in 2014 by Tonelli et al., it demonstrated an immediate effects of a brief loving kindness meditation as an intervention to reduce migraine pain. That's pretty cool. It can decrease chronic pain in a pilot study of patients with chronic lower back pain who were randomized to a loving kindness meditation or standard care. The loving kindness meditation was associated with greater decreases in pain, anger, and psychological distress than the control group. That one is Carson et al., 2005. Decreases PTSD. I want to revisit this once I'm done reading you these, but this is a really important one. This study was by Kearney et al., 2013, found that a 12-week loving kindness meditation course significantly reduced depression and PTSD symptoms among veterans diagnosed with PTSD. This one is pretty amazing. Decreased schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Whoa, I'd never heard that before reading this article. A pilot study by Johnson et al., 2011, examined the side effects of loving kindness meditation with individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and they found that loving kindness was associated with a decrease in negative symptoms and an increase in positive emotions and more psychological recovery. Pretty cool. Emotional intelligence in the brain. So we all know, I think, that our brain is shaped by our activities. And so practicing loving kindness strengthens the area of the brain that are more available for empathy and emotional intelligence. It activates empathy and emotional processing in the brain. And this was researched in 2 studies. So Hutcherson, Sepia, and Gross at 2014, and Hoffman, Grossman, and Hinton, 2011, again, increases the gray matter volume of your brain. Gray matter increases in the areas of the brain connected to emotional regulation. And those studies were Lung et al., 2013, and Lutz et al., 2008, and Lee et al., 2012. Stress response. So loving kindness meditation also benefits your psychology, which makes you more resilient. I can speak to that personally. So just 10 minutes of loving kindness meditation can have an immediate relaxing effect, which can decrease respiratory sinus arrhythmia, slows biological aging. We know that stress decreases the telomere length. The telomeres are those little bits of genetic material in your chromosomes that are biological markers for aging. However, in Hodge et al., 2013, they found that women that did loving kindness meditation had relatively longer telomere length compared to their age-matched controls. That's pretty cool. Social connection can make you a more helpful and kind person. It increases compassion, increases empathy. Kilmick, Leinberg, Lamb, and Singer, 2013, found that loving kindness meditation increased participants' empathetic responses to the distress of others. It can decrease your bias towards others. I really like this one. They phrased it, of course, very scientifically, but I have noticed with my students and with myself that one of the biggest benefits of a loving kindness practice is that it takes away that sense of othering, that sense of keeping other people separate, different, other than you, right? It takes that away. So in a recent study, Kang, Gray, and Dovito, 2014, found that compared to closely matched active control, a 6-week loving meditation training decreased the implicit bias against minorities. So yes, meditation can change the world. An increase in self-connection. A study by Ko et al. Found that those participants in a loving kindness meditation and interventions who experience more positive emotions, more gains in the perception of social connection as well. It helps with self-love and curbs self-criticism. And that was a study, Shahar et al., 2014, found that loving kindness meditation was effective for self-critical individuals in reducing the self-criticism, depressive symptoms, and improving self-compassion and positive emotions. So there's a whole bunch more in here. There's a couple more. I'm just briefly going over them point form. So that's a little bit about the science for those of you who love your studies. And again, I will link to that Psychology Today article, and they have all of the links embedded to the studies there so that you can check them all out. So there's the science, which might be some of the why we might choose to do a loving kindness meditation? Like, why would we want to do this practice anyway? So that's some of the scientific stuff. I'm going to talk now a bit more, and we've heard from the Buddha as well as to why he thinks we should do loving kindness. But I'm going to talk a little bit more now about why I practice it, what I've noticed, both with myself and with my students. And then we'll get a little bit into the how. How do we do this practice? How do I use it in my own life and in classes? You know how mindfulness is sort of like a buzz thing nowadays? It has been for several years. And it seemed like forever mindfulness was like the only Buddhist meditation that was getting any kind of scientific study. And so I'm so glad to see and to hear about those studies done with loving kindness. Because here's the thing, no meditation technique is a magic pill or a magic solution for everybody at every time. There are certain populations or certain times in life with certain people where actually a mindfulness meditation is not the best fit. For example, if someone is in a state of heightened anxiety in their life, they're really struggling. Maybe life is just really throwing them a curveball. Now, mindfulness has been proven to be helpful with anxiety for people that have generalized anxiety as a condition. But what I'm talking about here is times of extreme anxiety, where you're like in it because of whatever's happening in your life. Another example is trauma, right? So people that are currently working through trauma, sometimes mindfulness can actually be re-triggering of trauma. And then just for folks who need more self-care, especially those of you, and you know who you are when you're listening to this, who really tend to put everybody else first, and you tend to have a difficulty taking care of yourself. So this might be a far better practice for you than a mindfulness practice. And the other time that I personally have found it super impactful and useful is sort of twofold. When I started to realize, when I started kind of the spiritual part of my yoga practice, when I started meditating and trying to see the bigger picture and the bigger teachings of yoga beyond just the funny shapes we make with our body, I started to get more aware of the time that I spent judging other people. Now, we all do this. Every human has got this tendency of judgment, of othering, of separating yourself, right? It's sort of primitive. But when you start to meditate and you start to become aware of this tendency, that's when you can actually take some steps to work with that so that it's not so present in your life. Or at least when it pops up, you're aware of it and you have a solution or a counter to that. And I have found personally that metta practice or loving kindness meditation has been the best antidote for times when I am struggling to see the oneness between someone else and me. So I use it a lot for that. And that has been, I would say, hands down, the biggest feedback I've gotten from students when they bring a metta practice that I've introduced them to out into the world, even in just a very simple guided meditation form. The feedback I've gotten again and again from my students is how they've been able to be out in the world, whether it's driving the car and somebody cuts them off or somebody that in their life that really challenges them. And they've been able to come back to these metta practices and that it's made a real big difference in their life. Gets them out of that sort of judging mind and back into their wiser self, their more empathetic self, their more compassionate self. So that has been the biggest benefit that I have heard from my students. And I would say that is probably one of the biggest benefits also that I have experienced personally. I'll mention that I really will automatically go to a metta practice as my meditation, is that when the world feels like it's going to shit, when there is famines and wars and natural disasters and all the things happening, and these things are always happening somewhere, we just don't always know about them, but we're bombarded with certain wars, certain natural disasters, based on just what's out there in the media. And if you are a kind-hearted, deeply feeling person, this can really take a toll on you. And you can really start to feel very helpless to do anything, to make any impact, to improve the world, to help people. Because let's face it, most of us individually don't have a lot of control over a war that is across the world, other than writing to our politicians if they're involved in it. And so we can feel the heaviness of that constant bombardment of suffering. And for me, metta meditation is my go-to when I feel helpless to create change. Because, as I just discussed in all of those the good side effects of metta meditation from the article I was just reading from, and there's also been other studies that meditation can actually improve the world that we live in. I know this sounds incredibly woo-woo, but it's true. There's been studies that have shown that when people, especially in groups, sit and meditate, that crime rates have dropped. So meditation is a key to helping us to be more present. And I find that my metta meditation is the most helpful meditation when I feel like the world is going to hell and I feel helpless to help or create any sort of change in regard to that. So these are my go-to times for metta meditation. I have had anxiety on and off at varying degrees for my whole life. And so if there's a time when I'm going through a particularly anxious time, where life is lifing and things are just a bit more extreme than usual, the anxiety, then metta is my go-to practice. More often than not, I will choose a metta practice as my meditation. So I'm a big fan, you could say. So how do we even do this practice? Well, I'll just talk a little bit about how it's done. And then I'll talk about a script that I use. So if you go out on the internet and you Google metta phrases or metta scripts, you're going to find a whole bunch. I'll share my personal favorite with you and tell you why it's my favorite. Please feel free to use it if it resonates with you. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I actually use this in classes with students. Okay, so traditionally, metta meditation would start with you. So these phrases that I'll read you in a little bit would be directed to yourself. So it would be, may I be, may I, okay? To yourself first. Now, for some of you, this is the hardest stage. And historically, you would not continue to the next phases until you felt comfortable first with self-metta, right? You cannot give away what you do not have for yourself. And so for those of you who really struggle with sending yourself love, care, and attention, this is going to be the hardest part of this practice. And it's the one you should stay with until it doesn't feel hard anymore. I remember, I don't know if I heard it in an interview or if I read it in her book, but Sharon Salzberg saying that that was one of the biggest challenges for her when she started doing metta, is that her teacher was like, nope, you don't get to move on to the next phase until this one is ingrained in you, right? And so you might practice self-metta for years, right? So this is a staged practice. This isn't like we do all of these in one practice when we're new to this practice. It's staged. We start with ourselves. So that's phase one, self-metta. Sometimes for a lot of us, the hardest one. The next phase, in traditional Buddhist literature, they call it a benefactor, which I know on Western ears kind of doesn't land. You're like, huh? A benefactor? But keep in mind that this is at a time when monks were essentially being kept alive by donations from the lay people, from the public. So those would have been benefactors. Or if somebody who was wealthy, a king or somebody said, here, you can have this forest to meditate in, or you can have this house to rest in. So a benefactor. Now, for us as Westerners, that probably doesn't resonate, but you could think of a mentor or a teacher or a spiritual guide, right? So we start with ourselves, then we move to some sort of a benefactor, whether that be a mentor, a spiritual guide, a teacher, something like that, somebody who has helped you on your path. Then the next person we would move to is someone that you genuinely love and adore. This is the person you can bring to mind that as soon as you think of them, you smile. Okay, that's the next person that we send our metta to. So we've got self first, for many of you going to be the hardest, benefactor, then someone you love and adore. Then we go to a neutral person. So this is somebody that you see regularly, but maybe you don't know very well. So I often think of like the baristas at my local coffee shop. I like them. They're nice enough people. I don't know all their names, nor do I know anything about them, but they're a neutral person in my life that I could send these well wishes to. Then we move into an enemy. And this is usually where the second person gets tripped up. The second group of folks gets tripped up. This is the one I have struggles with. Now, when I say an enemy, you might be like me and think, I don't actually have an enemy. So you may not have an actual enemy, but it could be a public figure or a politician that you hold in low esteem, somebody who, when you see them, it just pushes that little button in you. That's who it could be. Now, I want to be very clear. When we're talking about the enemy or the person that we have challenges with, we do not want to choose somebody who we have a personal trauma history with. No, this is not about that. So if you have a really difficult relationship with somebody in your life because of abuse or trauma history, do not choose that person. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who just kind of annoys you. It could be a coworker, even your boss, who knows? We've all got a person, whether it's in our individual life or maybe it is a public figure like a politician or something that just kind of pushes our buttons. So that's the next person that we would do this loving kindness practice for. And then the icing on the loving kindness cake is all beings everywhere. So I'm going to go over the order of those again. First, we start with ourselves. For many of you, that is going to be the hardest one. So if you struggle with self-esteem, with self-love, with self-care, this is where you practice and practice and practice and practice and practice before you move on. You cannot skip over this and think that the rest of this practice is going to have the same power. It will not. Okay. And then a benefactor, maybe mentor, spiritual guide, teacher, something like that. Then someone you love, someone you genuinely love and adore, somebody that easily puts a smile to your face. Then we move to a neutral person. And then we move to an enemy or a perceived enemy or somebody who you dislike. Again, not somebody who you have a personal abuse or trauma history with. That is not appropriate for this meditation. Somebody who just annoys you or irks you, whether it's in your life or just out in the world. And then we send it out to all beings everywhere, the whole world. When I do this practice, because the first phase is self-metta, when I do this practice with my students in a yin class, that's where I stop. I don't do the rest of this practice. We stop with just self-metta. And the same with if I'm working with students. Now, the only time that I would introduce them to the whole practice is if I'm doing a longer course on this. So if I'm even doing a workshop, I'll introduce to the fact that you might eventually move here, but we're still going to stay with self-metta. But if I was doing a longer course, 6 to 8 week, 12-week course on metta, if we were doing more of a deep dive, then I would introduce my students to these other ones as appropriate. But again, some of them may have to go back and stick on the self. Okay. So that's how I use it. When I use it with students in class, I just do the self-metta. So we stay at the self part. And I'll tell you the 3 ways or so that I use it in class. And then I'll tell you also just how I use this both on my cushion and out in my life. So here is my script. Now, often when you Google metta phrases or metta wishes or whatever it is that you're Googling, you will notice that the first one is often, may I be happy. I don't use that. I switched it to something else because I don't believe that happy is actually a great translation of what was intended or meant in the original text. In fact, I wrote a whole article, which I will link in the episode notes for the Tattooed Buddha, on why I don't use happy. Happy to me feels unattainable. So I switched it to content because I feel like There are days where happiness is going to feel impossible or elusive, and happiness is fleeting. But contentment is much easier to find. So I just wanted to mention that's why my script does not use happy, for those of you that are familiar with metta scripts. So here's the one that I use most often. May I be well. May I be content. May I be at peace. May I be free. So you'll notice that's in first person, may I, may I. So if you're doing a meditation with your students while they're in their classes, that's the way you would read it to them, because they're going to be repeating it after you. I'll tell you how I do use that. But then if you were moving on to a more full version of this, if you mastered the I part, and now you are moving on to your benefactor, then you might switch it to may you, right? But we start with may I. I use metta meditation, as I mentioned, in my own practice as my primary meditation at this point. I do sometimes dabble in other forms of meditation. I've done, many, many forms of concentration and mindfulness meditations, but this tends to be the one where I land most often, both for the effects that it has on my own life and my own anxiety levels and my own spiritual path of wanting to be a kinder, less judgmental human, and for putting out as much good mojo into the world as possible. So that's why I use it the most often. Here's how I use it in classes. So sometimes as a teacher, and I talked a bit about this in the episode I did on, I think it's called Dear Yoga Teacher, Shut Up, or something like that, on how much silence we should have. So sometimes as a teacher of yin, there's these large spaces of silence where you can feel uncomfortable with the silence. So introducing a theme of metta and a metta script can be a great way to give them just a little bit and then still, again, be quiet. So how I would do this in practice is I would get them into their shapes and I would say to them, I'm going to say each of these lines 3 times. You are welcome to just let these words wash over you and then just settle into the shape in whatever way makes sense for you. Or if you find that these are helpful, if they're resonating with you, you're welcome to repeat them to yourself while you're in your shape, right? So if their mind is quite busy, or if they're really struggling, they're needing some extra self-care, they're welcome to repeat these to themselves while they're in the shape until we move into the new shape. Then we get into the next shape and I do the same thing. I say the lines 3 times each. I go through it 3 times and then I tell them, just let it wash over you. Or if you'd like, you can repeat to yourself. And I do that in every single pose. So that is one way that I use metta meditate with my students. This can be really helpful for times in the world where things are really heavy. And you feel like I want to address the fact that the world feels like it's going to hell right now in my class, but I really don't want to talk about war or whatever the case may be, famine, disasters, et cetera, et cetera. Bringing this in as a theme can be really soothing. It can be like a balm for the heart for your students and for yourself. So you can just explain to them that sometimes when the world feels like it's too much, this is a great practice and you can introduce it and do it with them in this way, in their poses. The other time I would do it is if I'm just using a self-care theme, or if there's certain times of year I find, especially around the holidays, the winter holidays. So for those who celebrate Christmas, especially, even those that love it, it can be a lot of extra to-dos on top of the to-dos that people already have in their busy lives. And people can just feel quite frazzled and exhausted at that time of year. So I'll often do a metta practice at that time of year for the students. So anytime you're doing a theme of maybe a heart opening practice, metta is a great practice to introduce. So those are just some ways in which I use them in class directly with students, where I'm actually teaching them a little bit, very briefly, about metta. I'm introducing the phrases to them. I'm saying the phrases in each pose, and I'm inviting them, if it resonates with them, to continue to say them. The other way that I use metta while teaching, here's a little secret hack, yoga teachers. Are you listening? When you're uncomfortable with silence, Or if you see somebody in your class that is clearly struggling a little, whether it's an emotion that's come up or whatever's happening, even it could just be they're kind of fidgety and impatient, or they're looking irritated, or they're sad, or whatever it is, whatever uncomfortable thing is happening that's throwing you off your game, that you're finding, ooh, I don't really know what to do about this. And again, I've done whole other episodes on this. So one with Grace, which again, I'll link, on how to hold brave space. And I've talked about emotions and the mind also. So those will all be linked. But another thing that I do as the teacher sometimes, if I can see that somebody's really struggling and the codependent side of me wants to rush over on my white horse and save the day, that is not appropriate, it's not my job, is I will sit at the front of the room, I will place one hand on my heart, and in my mind, I will send my students Metta. So I will look at one student and I will think to myself, while they're in their shapes, may you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free. And then I will look at the next student. May you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free. And I will continue that until time is up in that pose, and I'll guide them into the next shape, and then I'll continue where I left off. So this gives me something as a teacher to do while I'm at the front of the room and people are just hanging out, being still and quiet. That is not only something for me to do, but also, in my opinion, a way to put more out into the space as far as those intentions of oneness and of loving kindness and compassion and empathy. So that's a way that I use it as a teacher. And again, I'm not saying them out loud at that point. In this case, this is something that I'm just doing myself. I'm just looking at a student and saying, may you be well, may you be content, etc., etc. So it's just sending each individual student well wishes, or if you have a student that you can tell is really struggling, maybe you give a little bit more attention to them and a few more rounds of loving kindness for them. So that's how I use it in my life as a meditation practice. That's how I use it with my students. So a formal seated meditation practice, and it's also how I use it with my students. But I also take this out into the real world with me. So if you're just sitting on your butt planted in your house doing a meditation and it's not affecting the way you live your life, when you get off of your cushion, you are missing the point. So I will often bring this script out with me into the world. And there's two ways that I do that. The first way I briefly mentioned. So if I find that I come into a situation with somebody where my judging mind is going to take over. Maybe somebody cuts me off in the lineup at the coffee shop, or they aren't being very nice to the baristas, or they say something ignorant to me. When I notice that little tweaked part of my brain, that little judging mind part of my brain, I pause, and in my own mind, I say, may you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free, to that person. Right? So that's an individual person who may have just annoyed me, bothered me, sent me in a little bit of a huff, pushed some of my buttons. The other way that I use this out in the world is actually when I'm just walking down the street to every single person I see. So as a person passes me, now, of course, if there's a lot of people, if you live in a big city, you might not get all these lines done for everybody, but where you can, for each person that passes, may you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free. Then another person that I see, may you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free. So the benefit of that is not only are you sending out, of course, more well wishes and empathy, but you're also giving your own mind something to focus on. So if you tend to be the type of person like I do, who's constantly thinking, planning, list writing, analyzing, ruminating, criticizing, storytelling, itching, bitching, twitching, judging, you get the idea. This gives your mind something positive and consistent to chew on, because every time you see someone, you're saying the script to yourself. May you be well, may you be content, may you be at peace, may you be free. And of course, it will soften the edges of your judging mind, and you'll be putting that energy out into the world. So those are the ways that I use Metta practice. I love Metta practice. As I mentioned, it's my go-to. And please feel free to borrow my script, or you can just Google. There's so many good scripts out there. But don't be afraid also if you find one that you really like, but like one word isn't quite right, like me with happy, just to change it. Put your own word in there. It's totally fine, totally acceptable. So that's a bit of an overview. We talked about what loving kindness or metta practice even is. We talked about why you might want to do these from the historical Buddhist perspective. Like, why did the Buddha come up with these? What are they helpful for? We went over some of the sciencey stuff for those of you who really gravitate that way. And then I've talked about how I use this in my own personal meditation practice in my life when I'm on the cushion and when I'm off the cushion, and how I use it in the classroom with students, both guiding them to do their own self-metta, so saying it out loud to them and encouraging them if they'd like to repeat after me for the rest of the pose, or just as a teacher doing it silently to each student, or spending more attention on one student if they're really struggling and saying these phrases to yourself as you engage with that student. Now, I don't stare at them in a creepy way. Just bring them to mind, soft eyes, maybe a hand on the heart, and you can go through these phrases. So I hope that you found this helpful, both just with a bit of an understanding of what metta meditation is, and also some of the modern research, which I'm so glad, again, like I said, that they're finally studying this, because for a while there, it was all about mindfulness, and metta was not getting its just due. So I'm really glad that there's so many studies. Again, I will, in the show notes, link the other podcast episodes I mentioned. I will link the article for Psychology Today, which has the links embedded for each of the studies. I'll also put down 3 books that I think are really helpful if you want to learn more about metta practice, that you could buy and that you could go into on your own. And if this practice really resonates with you, I would encourage you to find a local Buddhist Sangha in your neighborhood and see if you can find a teacher to do these practices more in depth. Again, the last thing I want to say before we log off as a reminder is, remember that there is an order to this. There's a reason we start with self-metta. And the reason I keep harping on this is because I know there's a bunch of you that are going to want to skip over sending yourself all of these well wishes and go right to everybody else. And if you just heard that and went, yep, that's me, it's even more important for you that you stay with the self-metta and the discomfort of that, because you cannot pour from an empty cup. And I will leave you with a quote that is often attributed to the Buddha, but odds are it was not the Buddha. You yourself, as much as anyone else, deserve your love, compassion, and care. Okay? It has been disproven to be the Buddha, but nonetheless, it is true. You do need to give to yourself what you intend to give away to others. So for those of you that find that really challenging, there you go. Okay, my friends, I hope that you found this helpful. Please feel free, if you listen to this podcast regularly and you have ideas for the podcast, I would love to hear them. So just get at me on Instagram and let me know. You can leave me a little DM that says, I'd love to learn more about this, or I'd love to hear about this topic idea. And I would love to do that. So anything that is yin related, or part of the practice of yin, or questions you have about yin, any of that, please feel free to reach out and let me know. This is how I get ideas for new episodes. Okay, my friends, I hope you have a wonderful day. And until we meet again, bye for now.